What's up YouTube, Capital G here talking about the new format again in this video. This time I am focusing on budget decks, and these are actually decks that I believe can actually contend with some of the meta decks, some of the top decks that I talked about in yesterday's video. I feel like these decks maybe just need one thing to kind of break right in the duel, maybe to get that special top deck or just kind of open with like a 2-card combo, something of the sort. I'm basically judging the level of success for these decks to kind of be like the regional level where you might probably need to go 6-1 or 7-1, something like that. Not necessarily YCS where you might have 12 rounds of Swiss. I think all of these decks are very viable, and I think that you can build all the main decks for like $50, which is actually the price point that I've set. I know when I first started playing Yu-Gi-Oh, I was in high school and I couldn't afford cards like Mirror Force that were like $35 at the time from the Metal Raiders set, and I actually sympathize with younger players when I hear them complain about like the price of Ash Blossom or Heavy Metaphors Electromite. So this is a pretty good list to start with if you're looking for really cheap decks to kind of mess around with or to play at like a regional event. These decks are actually all very competent and they can actually handle some of the meta decks. I've omitted all the decks that I talked about yesterday just to try and give us more variety. Number 5, Dark Magician. So let's get things started with a deck that I actually like a lot from a personal standpoint. Dark Magician can be a very strange deck at times because it feels like a lot of your duels are completely feast or famine. You either get to your combo pieces early and man, you will just dumpster your opponents, or maybe you normal summon Rod, it gets Ash Blossomed, and then you're just left with a bunch of random cards in your hand like Dark Magician, a Prince Illusion, and other things that don't really make a threatening turn 1 board. However, this problem can actually be alleviated by adding more consistency cards to the deck like Pot of Duality, which actually can be discarded for a Prince Illusion if you already have all your combo pieces and don't need it as much, or if you just have to be able to special summon in your first turn. I would actually consider something like Upstart Goblin really strong in the deck as well. I think the Dark Magician is only one of, like a handful of decks in Yu-Gi-Oh right now that can have a lot of its important monsters unaffected by the dominant traps that have been added back into the game. Think of cards like Bottomless and Torrential Tribute. This is all thanks to a little card called Eternal Soul, which, makes your opponent's trap cards kind of moot. It also gives you a searchable Feather Duster in Dark Magic Attack. Dark Magic Attack was always a very strong card, but now it's even more auto win than it was before. If you're playing against kind of like a set 5 deck like Paleo, if they get hit with this card, you might as well just go to the next game. I think that having Spell and Trap negation from your graveyard in way of navigation is also important as well, because when you don't have Eternal Soul on the field, this can actually be the card that negates the Torrential, that negates the key Bottomless, so it keeps you in the duel. I think that DM needs to just focus more on consistency right now and getting to its combo pieces as early as possible, and that'll be kind of the recipe for success. Number 4, Star Seraph Herald. So Preparation of Rites is finally back at 3, which we haven't seen since the pre-Necros days, and I think that this deck is as good as it's going to get. There are some legitimate link plays here because of Stick and Chair and the fact that you can drop 3 monsters incredibly easily, which means possibly with your normal summon of Manju or Senju, you can actually summon things like Borolo Dragon, but for the most part, I think you're going to like stick with Xyz, probably Deltaros if you're going second, and Ouroboros if you're going first because it gets a card out of your opponent's hand. I think that Preparation going back to 3 means that you should be able to get to Ben 10 and Herald of Perfection like super consistently now turn 1, and you're not completely screwed if your opponent happens to Ash Blossom you, because Preparation is not a hard once per turn. The deck has some massive draw power, but not only with Metaphors Fusion potentially in the main deck, which not only can you pop on your side of the field, but you can actually send that to the graveyard with Ritual Sanctuary. But there is also the options, people have done this before, of running some Fluffle cards in there like Toy Vendor and Fluffle Wings to get you kind of like a little Pot of Greed engine in your deck to potentially draw some defensive cards, maybe your own hand traps to combat what your opponent wants to do. Herald is also one of the few decks in the game that can main deck Royal Decree, which puts an end to the trap meta really quickly, and we've actually seen in the past a lot of ritual decks have no problem bringing out the Denko Sekkas as well, so that can be another way that this deck can go second. It can summon that and it can leave your opponent with 5 cards on their field that are completely dead. So just because a lot of powerful trap cards have come back doesn't mean that this ritual deck doesn't have ways of fighting against that. I will acknowledge that Kaijus are probably going to be more prominent in the side decks because of of Towers and Masterpiece, and that card is just as strong as ever. But if you open with Herald of Perfection plus Ouroboros, you may have already hurt your opponent so much that 4 cards are not going to be able to counter your board. And of course, I get 4 cards because if your opponent Kaiju's you, then that's 1 card out of their hand, and Ouroboros is going to eat a card out of their hand as well. Number 3, Cosmo. Triple Bottomless, triple Torrential Tribute, no problem for this deck. Cosmo, in theory, should actually be tailor-made to thrive in a format like this. Bottomless isn't very effective against the deck because they can just put the Cosmo monsters back in their hand with Cosmo Town, and if you try to Bottomless the pilots, they can just tag out for the spaceships, so that's obviously not going to work out. Torrential, on the other hand, might just outright help Cosmo players because if I summon a Slip Rider and I threaten one of your random back row, if you chain Torrential, especially if I'm not targeting that, I have no problem just getting a new monster to kill you with, and I also get to potentially blow up another card on your side of the field with the Cosmo ship. Cosmo also possesses the ability to OTK out of nowhere because Farm Girl and Dark Destroyer are still incredibly powerful, and if people are going to use Solemn Judgment, that just makes the OTKs even more likely, I'd argue. I don't think Cosmo were ever really suited for the hand trap era and to be able to run a whole bunch of hand traps. I think that obviously they didn't adjust that well, but if we're going to be relying on hand traps a lot less now, I think that just benefits them because they can focus those card slots on their consistency and making sure that they open up with Cosmo Town or can get to it as quickly as possible. Number 2, Hat. Talk about a blast from the past. I decided to include one of 2014's best decks that hasn't been around at full strength since the end of the Zexal era. For starters, Ice Hand is looking beyond amazing in a format with so many good traps running around, and I think the hands in general are just fantastic cards for going second because they can safely be set against almost any turn 1 board, and they really only fall to effect negators like Solemn Strike, which a lot of archetypes don't have inherent ways of actually taking out monster effects. The Trap Tricks engine got a pretty big boost from Bottomless Trap Hole now being unlimited. By the way, we have so many more revival cards in the game that we didn't have back when Hat was at full power. Think about cards like Monster Reborn, Back to the Front, Oasis of the Dragon Souls. These are all cards that you can use with Trap Tricks Myrmilio's second effect. She can end up blowing up a card on your opponent's side of the field, Pendulum Scales, Problem Back Row, Field Spells, etc., etc. So those are all very good options. Lastly, since you're running the Artifact engine, which actually is conveniently back at full power as well, not only do you get a nice piece of spot removal and disruption from Artifact Moraltech, which does not target, by the way, shoutouts to Borlo Dragon, but Artifact Scythe is another card that's really solid coming out of the side deck, can be used against Fusion and Exceed-based archetypes, or I guess Synchro as well, basically telling them no for a turn, and your opponent just won't be able to go and attack your back row because as soon as they see an Artifact monster, you're basically getting a nice level of protection. They're not going to Twin Twister you. They're not going to probably risk using things like Heavy Storm Duster because if they happen to hit a Sanctum or an Artifact monster, they're going to be extremely screwed. Honorable mentions include Dino-Mist, which I actually thought about putting at the 5 spot. I think the consistency is fairly even with Dark Magician. I think that the deck has gotten better with Qliphort Genius, and you know, the effects of the Pendulum Scales to protect you from Bottomless and Torrential is really solid. My problem with Dino-Mist is really just the power ceiling of the deck. It's so damn low for a Pendulum deck because I think the scales are too limiting. Really, it feels like the power ceiling is maybe the lowest out of all Pendulum decks, with the exception being Mythical Beast because that deck can't even Pendulum Summon. Finally, to our number 1, Altergeist, or as I personally call them, Altergeist. So, Altergeist is my deck, and I'm not going to be biased here. I do believe Altergeist are flat out amazing, and quite frankly, I think it's only a matter of time before it becomes the best stun deck in the TCG. Like, I'm going to say within 6 months, like it is in the OCG. Yes, we don't have Multi-Faker like they do over there, and it is a different format because Buster Dragon and Totally Awesome are limited in the OCG, thus kind of making ABC and Paleo like near unplayable. Regardless of all that, Altergeist can be like they're a deck that can stand on their own 2 feet in the TCG. They have a searchable Divine Wrath in Altergeist Protocol. This is not only a card that can negate your opponent's monster effects, which last time I checked almost every deck in Yu-Gi-Oh wants to use, but it also makes your cards unable to be negated on the field. This is really important because your opponent will try to strike your cards, and it's a legal activation of their strike. The strike just doesn't stop your cards, and you basically just get your opponent's strike for free. There are so many people who don't read cards and they end up doing that. You also have a themed Call of the Haunted and Manifestation that is searchable, and it means that your Altergeist monsters don't really stay dead for that long. One of my favorite things about Altergeist is how the deck can go second very easily. Even if your opponent goes like set 5 back row, Summon Miluseek, attack directly. If your opponent takes the attack, you end up getting a card off their field, and you go on to Linkuriboh in main phase 2, you get a search, so you end up +2ing. If they don't take the attack, then they're still in kind of a bad situation. She's too small to be bottomless. If they Torrential or they Solemn Strike her effect, that's fine. They still go -1 anyways, and they may have already taken a bunch of damage from like the Solemn Strike, or they could potentially lose a monster from their own Torrential. So Miluseek is a card that like makes going second really good. Same thing with Marionetta. That's a card that is an instant +1. One of the other things that I really like about Altergeist is how like hand traps just aren't good against the deck. There's only like 1 or 2 cards in your entire deck that can really be Ash Blossomed. A lot of times, even if Miluseek gets Ashed, it doesn't matter because you have another card in your hand to keep your engine going. Yeah, you know, Marionetta can be Ghost Ogre, but you still get a search anyways, and if it's that bad, you can get a manifestation to just bring her back. I think that they're like the biggest problem with Altergeist is really the lack of good monsters in the TCG. Conqueror is not really good. It's a one of, and it's a one of you never kind of want to draw. You always want to search it from Miluseek. And also the like unkillable monsters, like really big boss monsters like Towers, Masterpiece, Borreload. Those are cards that like Altergeist kind of have to struggle to get off the board. Outside of those 2 problems, Altergeist is an extremely strong deck, and it's probably one of the best grinding decks in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like the entire TCG, I'd say top 2 or 3 when it comes to just grinding out duels because of Altergeist Sequidius, which has a built-in evac on it, and even if it dies, it just, you know, floats because it gets a trap from the graveyard back. So if you bring it back with manifestation, you like have infinite amount of just bouncing. There's also just loops you can do with like Conqueror, where Conqueror will always block an attack, negate a card on your opponent's side of the field, you bounce it, and then you bounce one of your opponent's cards on the field, they attack again, you summon the same Conqueror, and just kind of repeat the process during your next turn. So what did you guys think of the list? If there were any just really good strong budget decks that you guys believe in that I did not include, leave that in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already, turn on that notification bell for daily videos.